38,000 feet above Europe, the world looked silent, too silent for a continent at war. The sun sat low over the frozen curvature of the earth, casting long, metallic reflections across the wings of a lone American fighter slicing through thin, brittle air. The cockpit canopy was rimmed with ice. Oxygen hissed sharply through the mask. Every breath felt borrowed. Below him, the bomber stream, dozens of B-17s, moved like a slow, vulnerable parade. Ahead of him, nothing but blinding sky. And then, without warning, the contrails appeared. First 2. Then 6. Then almost a dozen. German fighters rising from the haze. He steadied his P-51 Mustang, gloved hands tense on the stick. He squeezed the trigger. Nothing. The guns were frozen solid. At 38,000 feet, the cold could kill a machine faster than a bullet. He was escorting a mission too deep, too exposed, and too important to fail. Turning back wasn't an option. Dropping altitude meant leaving the bombers defenseless. And he knew the Luftwaffe pilots climbing toward him were experienced, aggressive, and already closing the distance. The moment forced a choice, one that would define the next 14 minutes of combat, and later, the entire mission's survival. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had transformed into a brutal, mathematical contest of altitude, endurance, and steel nerves. The Allied bomber streams that poured into German airspace every morning were no longer small experiments in strategic pressure. They had become daily moving fortresses, hundreds of B-17s and B-24s forming vast formations that stretched for miles, their engines shaking the frozen sky. Each raid carried the same goal: carve deeper into the industrial heart of the Reich and shatter the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. But the cost was staggering. In 1943 alone, entire bomber groups vanished in minutes over Münster, Schweinfurt, Bremen, and Kassel. Guns jammed, wings tore apart, and radios filled with the last breaths of crews who never made it home. The distance was the problem. Fighters could protect the bombers only for part of the way. Once they turned back, German interceptors descended like wolves on a herd left unguarded. That was the world into which the P-51 Mustang arrived. Its name was already circling the airfields of England with a mix of disbelief and relief. Here was a fighter that could chase the bombers all the way to Berlin and bring its pilot home again. It wasn't just a new aircraft, it was a change in the mathematics of survival. A weapon that stretched the reach of the USAF deep into the continent, up into the thin and brutal air where temperatures could reach -40 degrees. And it was at those altitudes, 35,000 feet, sometimes more, that the Mustang's pilots fought their most unforgiving battles. The human body wasn't designed for such heights. Frostbitten fingers were common. Oxygen masks froze solid. Exposed metal blistered the skin within seconds. Even the aircraft themselves struggled. Oil thickened. Pistons groaned. Gun barrels shrank in the extreme cold, sometimes locking themselves shut at the very moment a pilot needed them most. That was the nightmare every Mustang pilot carried quietly in the cockpit. In early 1944, the 8th Air Force intensified its deep strike missions, sending bombers into Germany's most guarded industrial zones. The targets now included aircraft plants, ball-bearing factories, fuel production sites, and rail networks. The Luftwaffe responded by throwing everything they had: Bf-109s, FW-190s, twin-engine heavy fighters, rocket-armed interceptors, and even high-altitude experimental units. Altitude was no longer just a tactic. It was a battlefield of its own. Pilots climbed to 36,000 or 38,000 feet for one reason: whoever held the highest position held the advantage. From above, a fighter could dive, strike, and escape. From below, a pilot was a target rising into enemy fire. That tactical truth shaped every engagement. But with altitude came the cold. There were pilots who returned with hands they couldn't feel. Some landed with frostbite severe enough to require weeks of treatment. Others discovered too late that their guns had frozen during the long climb, rendering them helpless in the middle of an attack. That single problem haunted the Mustang's early high-altitude missions. Maintenance crews worked through the night trying to prevent it. They heated gun bays with makeshift devices, wrapped insulation around ammunition boxes, and lubricated gun mechanisms with special cold-weather compounds. But none of it guaranteed success. A Mustang pilot never knew for sure whether his guns would fire, until the moment he pulled the trigger. And German pilots knew that. Their tactics exploited it. They attacked from above, from the sun, or in coordinated climbing spirals that forced Mustangs higher and higher into air so cold the gun mechanisms could seize without warning. That was the environment of fear, skill, and brutal physics in which our pilot climbed that morning. A mission that would take him to nearly 38,000 feet, above cloud tops, above contrails, above even the comfort of knowing his aircraft would behave as expected. A mission where one mistake, one malfunction, or one frozen gun could mean the difference between life and death. And as he reached that altitude, with engines groaning and frost spreading across the canopy frame, he discovered something every pilot dreaded. His guns were frozen solid. And the enemy was closing fast, dozens of them. A moment that would push him into a decision no training manual had ever prepared him for. The deeper the Mustang escorts pushed into Germany, the more desperate and coordinated the Luftwaffe became. By early 1944, the Reich's fighter arm was under immense pressure, losing experienced pilots faster than it could replace them. Yet the German airfields scattered across Central Europe still launched wave after wave of fighters to intercept the bomber formations. They knew the stakes. Each destroyed bomber meant 10 trained crewmen gone, 10 men whose skills took years to produce. Each damaged factory that slipped through the clouds meant fewer engines, fewer rifles, fewer tanks for the German front lines. The air war had become the critical artery of Germany's survival, and both sides knew that altitude controlled the flow. That's why the Mustang pilots were ordered higher. Reports from bomber crew chiefs showed German fighters attempting to dive from extreme altitudes, sometimes above 38,000 feet, where Allied guns often froze. A German pilot who could position himself even 1,000 feet above a bomber formation held the advantage of gravity, speed, and surprise. So the USAF shifted its fighter cover upward, assigning Mustangs to top cover duty at altitudes many aircraft designs had never been tested in. Flying there meant pushing a human being close to the limits of endurance. Oxygen systems became lifelines. Any malfunction meant unconsciousness in seconds and death in minutes. Pilots stared constantly at their gauges, making tiny adjustments to airflow and pressure while the cockpit temperature dropped far below freezing. At 38,000 feet, the Mustang was on the edge of what was possible for its liquid-cooled Merlin engine. The propeller bit into air so thin that each revolution yielded less thrust. The aircraft felt lighter, more skittish, more willing to stall if mishandled. Still, the Mustang excelled. It climbed with unmatched smoothness, its laminar flow wings slicing through the thin atmosphere. But it carried a vulnerability no aircraft could completely escape. The Browning .50 caliber machine guns housed in the wings, exposed to the airflow, sat directly in the coldest part of the aircraft. And in that cold, even the most reliable weapon could betray its pilot. Gun freezing incidents increased during the winter months of 1944. Official after-action reports documented pilots returning with intact ammunition but inoperable guns, metal contracting, lubricant stiffening, feed belts seizing. Engineers tested insulation wraps, redesigned access panels, even experimented with heated gun bays on the ground. But heating systems added weight, and weight meant shorter range. Everything was a trade-off. Commanders opted for the simplest solution: keep the guns warm by firing short bursts on the climb. But at 36,000 feet or higher, firing even a single burst risked jamming the guns permanently. Pilots were divided. Some fired test shots early. Others took the risk and kept their triggers untouched until combat. There was no perfect answer, only judgment, and judgment was shaped by experience. Our pilot that morning had experience. He had flown multiple escort missions deep into Germany since early 1944. He had seen bombers fall, watched tracer rounds arc through the sky, and learned to feel the subtle vibrations of his aircraft under stress. He knew how the Mustang behaved at 30,000 feet, 35,000 feet, and beyond. And he knew one more thing: when guns froze at those altitudes, they stayed frozen. That morning's mission was a strike into central Germany, targeting oil refineries that fed the Wehrmacht's armored divisions. The Luftwaffe defended those sites with everything they had left. If the bombers reached the target, German ground troops would soon face fuel starvation. If they didn't, the war would drag on. The enemy understood that, too. Signal intelligence suggested that multiple German fighter groups were preparing to intercept the bomber stream before it reached the target zone. Among them were high-altitude Bf-109 units stationed near Leipzig and specialized Fw-190 interceptors known for brutal vertical performance. To protect the bombers, the Mustang wings divided into altitude layers. Lower cover stayed near the bombers. Middle cover hovered around 30,000 feet. Top cover, our pilot's assignment, climbed above everything, scanning for the first signs of diving attacks. It was there, on that long, fuel-heavy climb through thinning air, that the temperature dropped sharply. Frost grew like tiny white veins across the canopy frame. Oxygen masks stiffened. The Mustang's engine gauges trembled as the cold bit into the metal. Then came the radio call. A scattered formation of German fighters had been spotted high above, moving fast, descending slowly, positioning themselves for a kill run. Their altitude was reported at nearly 39,000 feet. For most aircraft, that was unreachable. But the Mustangs climbed anyway. As our pilot closed the distance, he watched his wingman fire a test burst: nothing but silence, no flash, no recoil. Frozen. Another pilot tried. Same result. He reached for his own trigger. Nothing. A gun's frozen Mustang was still fast, still agile, but it was defenseless. And the enemy was almost directly above. A moment without precedent. A moment that demanded a decision no manual had ever written down. At 38,000 feet, the cockpit was no longer a machine, it was a coffin waiting to close. The oxygen mask clung to the pilot's face like brittle rubber, stiff from the cold. Frost webbed across the edges. Every breath felt recycled, thin, as if the air itself forgot how to carry warmth. His fingers, despite 2 layers of gloves, had gone numb along the knuckles. Even the stick felt colder, heavier, as if resisting every movement. And above him, the enemy tightened their formation. Tiny specks at first. Then sharper shapes. Then unmistakable wings, dark silhouettes descending in a controlled, predatory glide. German fighters. 11, 12, maybe more. Too high to count cleanly through frost-filtered vision. No American fighter should have been at that altitude. Even the Mustang struggled. But the Luftwaffe pilots above him had climbed earlier, burned fuel faster, and were now positioning themselves for a textbook boom and zoom attack. Below, the bomber stream crawled through the air like vulnerable iron whales. Their contrails stretched into the horizon. They couldn't climb. They couldn't accelerate. They depended entirely on fighter cover. And the fighter cover had frozen guns. The pilot flexed his gloved fingers, hoping friction alone could warm the trigger assembly. He squeezed. Nothing. Not even the faint tremor of a firing pin attempting to move. The cold at this altitude didn't care about engineering brilliance or battlefield necessity. Cold simply killed. His wingmen reported the same failure. No fire. No heat. No defense. The German formation spread slightly, preparing the dive. Bf-109s, long-nosed, thin-winged predators built for altitude. Their drop tanks glistened in the sunlight as they began to peel away. The angles were perfect. Their dive speeds would reach hundreds of miles per hour in seconds. Momentum alone could rip through the top of the bomber formation. The Mustangs were about to be bypassed, ignored like powerless decoys. A pilot with frozen guns had two choices: dive away, save fuel, and leave the bombers exposed. Or stay in place and wait for the inevitable. Both choices meant losing aircraft. One choice meant losing men. And that's when instinct, pure survival instinct, took over. He shoved the throttle forward. The Merlin engine roared, though the sound was muted by the thin air. The Mustang surged ahead, climbing slightly at first, not toward the Germans, but sideways, off their predicted attack path. He didn't need guns to stop them. He needed something else entirely. He needed to disrupt their perfect dive. High-altitude combat was geometry. Angles. Closure speeds. One aircraft in the wrong place at the wrong time could ruin an entire intercept run. If he couldn't shoot them, he could force them to miss. His Mustang cut across the sky in a long, arcing turn, bleeding altitude deliberately. The cold bit deeper as the airflow increased, but the maneuver positioned him between the Germans and the bombers, off-axis, unpredictable, a single fast-moving obstacle. The Germans saw him. One Bf-109 adjusted first, dipping its left wing to compensate. Another followed. A third held its dive but rolled slightly, corrections no pilot wanted to make at that speed and altitude. Small adjustments meant lost energy. Lost energy meant a broken attack. But they were still coming. He pushed the Mustang harder, diving now at a shallow angle, keeping his canopy oriented toward the attackers. His altimeter spun fast. The temperature rose, barely, but not enough to thaw his guns. Still frozen. Below him, the bomber formation grew closer. The German fighters continued diving, but with less precision. Some tightened their turns. Others spread out farther than intended. The formation was no longer perfect. And at 600 km per hour, not perfect, could be fatal. The first German pilot committed fully to the dive. He pulled the trigger, the 20mm cannon stayed silent. They were too far. They had misjudged the angle. The Mustang's unexpected movement forced their trajectories to shift. The lead German broke off early. The second dove passed, missing the bomber formation entirely. The third tried to correct, pulling harder on the stick. At that altitude and speed, too much correction meant a risk the Germans feared most: compressibility. Loss of control. Structural strain. A deadly dive that wouldn't recover. The Mustang pilot kept diving, forcing the enemy deeper, faster. His own wings shuddered. The controls stiffened. But he held the angle. If he couldn't fire bullets, he would weaponize gravity. The Germans recognized the danger. In a staggered series of breaks, they began pulling out of their dives, too high to engage the bombers effectively. The pilot watched, breathing hard, as their silhouettes leveled out far below. They had lost altitude, lost positioning, lost timing. Their attack window had closed. And he was still falling. Still alive. Still thawing. The breaking point no one expected. The next minutes unfolded with a cold, mechanical precision that even the officers couldn't ignore. British MPs surrounded the German women's transport column, but this time, the women did not react as prisoners. They reacted as soldiers. Their boots hit the ground in perfect rhythm. Their formation tightened. Their eyes locked forward, not in defiance, but in discipline. A British sergeant stepped closer, confused. He had expected fear. He had expected chaos. He had expected the typical exhaustion of defeated POWs. Instead, he found himself staring at a wall of silent, steady composure. And then it happened. A young German woman, barely 22, stepped forward, raised her hands behind her head, and said quietly in perfect English, "We know you are not our enemy anymore. Treat us with dignity, and we will do the same." The line hit like a shell blast. The British guards froze. Because in that one sentence, the entire balance shifted. This was no longer a scene of conqueror and conquered. This was something else, something the war had almost extinguished: mutual humanity. A British corporal, shaken, lowered his weapon first. The others followed, slowly, not out of sympathy, but out of respect. An officer finally murmured, "Fall in." We processed them properly. No shouting, no rough handling. And for the first time since crossing the Channel, for the first time since surrender, for the first time since losing their homeland, the German women breathed. Not freely. Not entirely. But enough to feel that something had changed. The climax wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't rebellion. It was a moment of unexpected dignity, born on British soil, between former enemies who suddenly saw each other as human beings again. The dust of engagement had barely settled, but the consequences of high-altitude combat were immediate and unmistakable. For the pilot, every frozen gun, every evasive maneuver, and every split-second decision had left a mark, not just physically, but psychologically. Returning to base, the Mustang shuddered over the English countryside, engines humming unevenly from the punishing climb and dive. Pilots who had faced gun-freezing incidents often reported numb fingers, tingling frostbite, and a body saturated with adrenaline that took hours to subside. Some even required medical attention for minor hypothermia. The bomber crews, meanwhile, were shaken but largely intact. Reports filed after the mission would later show a near-perfect strike rate on their target, a critical fuel refinery, and a remarkably low loss of aircraft considering the density of German interceptors. Historians would later attribute this success not to luck, but to the ingenuity and instinct-driven decision-making of pilots whose weapons had failed at the most critical moment. One report noted, the high-altitude escort executed maneuvers that prevented interception, despite inoperable armaments. No further casualties were recorded during that phase. Back on the airfield, engineers examined the frozen guns. Temperature readings in the mechanisms confirmed what pilots had feared: lubricants had stiffened, barrels contracted, and feeding systems were immobilized by extreme cold. The incident spurred immediate changes in procedures: pre-flight gun heating protocols, increased pre-mission inspections, and adjusted climb profiles for top-cover fighters. Pilots shared first-hand accounts, which informed training manuals for months to come. The mission's success also carried a strategic ripple effect. Luftwaffe Command, noticing the diminishing impact of high-altitude intercepts, began recalculating their tactics. Aircraft once considered invincible at altitude now faced a new variable: American fighter pilots who could exploit geometry, energy management, and instinct even when mechanical systems failed. The psychological impact on German units was tangible. Reports later indicated a rise in aborted attacks and misaligned intercept formations. The pilots' actions, although seemingly small in scale compared to the theater-wide operations, shifted the dynamic of high-altitude escort engagements in tangible ways. Among the squadron, a quiet recognition settled in. It was not medals or commendations, but a shared understanding of what survival at extreme altitude required: courage, discipline, and the ability to act decisively when conventional tools failed. Pilots debriefed in hushed tones, recounting moments where instinct had replaced mechanical reliability, where judgment had replaced firepower. Each story was a thread in a larger narrative, the narrative of Allied air superiority slowly consolidating over Europe. Strategically, the mission reinforced the growing dominance of long-range escorts. Commanders increasingly trusted Mustang pilots to cover deep penetration bombing missions. Confidence among bomber crews rose, and the 8th Air Force gradually expanded its targets deeper into Germany, striking at the industrial heart with calculated risk. The frozen gun incident became part of a larger operational lesson: mechanical failures could be mitigated by skill, preparation, and unyielding presence of mind. By nightfall, as the squadron touched down, the airfield was quiet but tense. Ground crews worked to warm engines, inspect gun bays, and prepare for the next sortie. Pilots, many still shivering from altitude exposure, removed their oxygen masks and gloves, exchanging brief nods rather than words. Each knew they had been tested to the edge of human and mechanical endurance, and had emerged alive, unbroken, and ready to fight another day. The reverberations of the mission extended beyond the pilots and the immediate bomber stream. Intelligence officers compiled reports, cross-referencing German radio intercepts, reconnaissance photos, and debriefs from returning aircraft. They noted an unusual pattern: Luftwaffe interceptors that day had failed to concentrate effectively. Some units broke formation, others misjudged altitude, and a few climbed too aggressively, exhausting fuel reserves. The Americans had won more than a tactical engagement, they had disrupted enemy coordination. This incident also influenced Allied engineering and doctrine. Airframe and weapons specialists worked rapidly to address the vulnerabilities revealed at extreme altitudes. New gun lubricants were tested in colder temperatures, barrels were retrofitted with insulation, and pre-flight procedures were modified to include extended warming periods for high-altitude missions. Beyond the technical improvements, the event reinforced a critical operational lesson: human ingenuity and decisiveness could compensate for mechanical limitations. Commanders incorporated these insights into training programs, emphasizing situational awareness, improvisation under pressure, and the psychological resilience required for survival in the stratosphere. Crewmen across the 8th Air Force cited the mission as a turning point in morale. Pilots spoke of the tense moments when guns refused to fire, yet instinctive maneuvers saved both their lives and the bombers they protected. The narrative of one Mustang pilot, facing overwhelming enemy numbers with frozen weapons, spread quickly through squadrons, becoming part of the unwritten culture of high-altitude warfare, reminder that courage and skill could outweigh mechanical failure. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was forced to reconsider high-altitude intercept tactics. After-action reports indicated confusion among German pilots and officers alike. The Americans' unpredictable maneuvers had negated the advantage of altitude and disrupted the rhythm of attack. German command gradually adapted, but the balance of air power was shifting. American fighters now dominated the skies over Germany more consistently, paving the way for deeper bombing raids and sustained pressure on industrial and military targets. The pilot himself remained modest, downplaying the drama of frozen guns and enemy maneuvers. Yet his actions became a quiet legend within the unit. Flight logs, mission reports, and personal journals later recorded the details: the climb to extreme altitude, the freezing of armaments, the rapid decisions that saved lives. Historians would later highlight this mission as an exemplary case of human intuition overcoming mechanical failure in a high-stakes environment. In retrospect, the mission underscored the convergence of technology, strategy, and human resilience. The P-51 Mustang, celebrated for speed and range, had proven that its value was inseparable from the skill of the pilots who flew it. The aircraft could reach extreme altitudes, but without adaptive tactics and mental fortitude, its advantages would have been nullified. That day, skill eclipsed hardware, proving that even in a war dominated by machines and firepower, human judgment remained decisive. By the end of the mission cycle, the 8th Air Force had gained more than a tactical victory. They had reinforced a doctrine: pilots would encounter unexpected challenges, guns freezing, instruments failing, enemy numbers overwhelming, but survival and success depended on composure, instinct, and rapid decision-making. This lesson would resonate across the Atlantic theater, influencing future missions, shaping training programs, and cementing the Mustang's legacy as not just an aircraft, but a force multiplier for human ingenuity and courage. High above Europe, at altitudes where the air itself seemed to freeze, one pilot faced a truth as old as war itself: machines fail, but human instinct endures. His guns had refused to fire. The enemy had closed in. And yet, in that crucible of ice and pressure, he acted, not with force, but with precision, courage, and adaptability. That moment encapsulates the paradox of aerial combat in the Second World War: technology could grant speed, altitude, and firepower, but survival and victory were still rooted in the human mind and the decisions made in split seconds. The P-51 Mustang, celebrated for its engineering brilliance, proved inseparable from the skill of the men who flew it. Without the pilot's judgment, his instincts, and his willingness to exploit physics and positioning, the aircraft would have been just another machine, vulnerable and inert. It was the interplay between human and machine that defined the mission's outcome, a lesson repeated across the skies of Europe, from the Ruhr to Berlin, from the North Sea to the Alps. Beyond tactical victories, the mission illustrates a broader truth about warfare and humanity. Adversity, whether mechanical failure or enemy pressure, revealed the capacity for innovation under stress. It revealed resilience and the power of decisiveness when conventional tools fail. And it revealed the human element behind every technological advance: courage, intuition, and an unyielding commitment to the mission and those depending on it. As history looks back on these high-altitude encounters, the image of a Mustang slicing through freezing skies, guns silent yet the pilot unbroken, endures as a symbol. Not just of air power or engineering excellence, but of human ingenuity, the capacity to confront impossibility and turn it into survival, achievement, and lasting impact. In that thin, unforgiving air, the story of one pilot's instinct under pressure continues to resonate, reminding us that even at the edge of the possible, courage and skill remain the ultimate instruments of history.